Great, thank you. Well, welcome. I'm Mia Redivan of the AIM Center at CAST, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar. Before we begin, you should know a few things about our Zoom environment. First, live captioning is provided. To view the captions, click on the closed caption button in the Zoom menu. Captions will appear along the bottom of your screen. Thank you to our caption provider, Karen from ACS Captions, for her service today. Although your audio lines are muted, we'd love to know your thoughts and questions throughout the presentation. Please use the chat to do this. If not already visible, click the chat panel button. Above the field where you enter the text, there is a blue drop-down menu. Be sure to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone in the room can benefit from your comments. Throughout the webinar, Leslie O'Callahan will be dropping links to resources for your convenience. And if you are tweeting, please use the hashtag AIM4ALL. That's AEM, the number 4, ALL. The PowerPoint file and digital handouts for the webinar are available for download from the AIM Center events page. The webinar is being recorded and we will archive on our YouTube channel. As soon as it is available, a link to the recording will be posted on the events page. It's now my pleasure to turn over the presentation to our presenters, Joy Zabala and Diana Carl.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. My name is Joy Zabala, and I am the Director of Technical Assistance at CAST, and I'm also the Director Emeritus of the AIM Center that brings this presentation to you. My colleague, Diana Carl, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator at the AIM Center, and in my background, I was an Associate School Psychologist and a Special Education Director. That gives you a little bit of our background. Joy was a teacher in education for many years, so we kind of have all different sides covered today for presenting this webinar.
Thank you, Diana. So the major topics for today are what are AIM and accessible technology, looking at two sides of the accessibility coin, a brief overview of IEPs and where AIM might fit, where AIM and accessible materials and technologies be considered and documented in the IEP. So with that, we'll start with what are accessible educational materials, which we call AIM. So in federal law, there is a requirement, section 300-172 of the regulations of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act actually says there are provisions that require state and local education agencies to ensure that printed textbooks and related core instructional materials are provided to students with print disabilities in specialized formats in a timely manner. One thing that's very important to know about this is the legal requirement to provide materials to people who need specialized formats or some other way of gaining information and materials. The legal requirement is absolutely placed on state and local education agencies. IDEA cannot place requirements on publishers. One of the wonderful things is publishers are beginning to place those requirements on themselves. And we'd like to hope that, at least in small part, it's because of the about 25 years that CAST has been involved in this work, and CAST, along with colleagues and partners and LEAs and SEAs all over, have really been asking much more for these kinds of materials that can be used by all. And that is a call now that publishers are beginning to answer in a big way. So when we talk about specialized formats, which you might sometimes hear called accessible formats, but there are 4 of them. They are Braille, large print, audio, and digital text. And the key to a specialized format is to know that It includes exactly the same information as in the printed materials. There's nothing added, there's nothing taken away. It's exactly the same information. And it's only the presentation of the material that is different. It can be presented in Braille, tactily. It can be presented in large print, which of course, most of us are familiar with large print. The older I get, the more familiar I'm getting with large print. There is also the audio format, and the audio format, the thing that's important to remember about the audio format is it does not have a visual component. It is purely auditory. So you're basically reading the material auditorily. And then there is the digital text format. We'll talk a little bit more about digital text as opposed to digital materials. But for right now, digital text is the format. And of course, what we know about digital text is it does give us the opportunity to provide both the visual and the auditory information at the same time. And depending on your setup and the particular assistive technology, you could also have Braille material presented at the same time as audio is presented. So lots of flexibility, but those are the 4 specialized formats: Braille, audio, large print, and digital text. So there was a language change in 2015 because when IDEA was first reauthorized, some of the language that I just told you about seemed to be very appropriate. The notion of print-based materials, because lots and lots of print-based materials were being used. And a lot of print-based materials are still being used. We don't want to fool ourselves about that. But there are also lots and lots of technology-based materials. So in 2015, in a footnote, sort of hidden away in a footnote, was a definition that the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs has changed that meaning just a bit to make it broader and be much more useful in today's world. So now, accessible educational materials means print and technology-based educational materials, including printed and electronic textbooks and related core materials. All of the rest of the things are the same, basically. But the notion that it's not just about printed materials, but all materials that are being used for educational purposes that students need to be able to perceive and interact with in order to learn are the materials that are being talked about in this requirement. So there are also 2 other laws that are important to know about. We in schools tend to think IDEA is about us, and it is, but it does not mean that these 2 laws are not also about us. And they are Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Both of them prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. So they cannot prohibit a person from participating in something for which they are otherwise qualified to be a part of on the basis of their disability. It also speaks to the obligation of public schools to provide accessible educational materials to students who need them. So it's not just IDEA, but also civil rights and also the ADA civil rights and the federal Section 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act also have these requirements behind them. So what are accessible educational materials? They are materials that are designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable by the widest possible range of student variability, regardless of the format they're in, whether they're print or digital, graphical, audio, video, some other thing that you're thinking of that I'm not saying, that whatever it is that's being used in schools needs to, if they're accessible, they need to be designed or enhanced in ways that make them usable by the widest possible range of individuals. Content may be what some people call born print, which means it is intended to be used as print, and it requires retrofitting to be accessible. That it's required that it be transformed into Braille, large print, audio, digital text. But content may also be born digital. It may be intended to be digital by everyone who's using it, they're going to use it in a digital format. However, when materials are born digital, if they are not designed with accessibility in mind, it is difficult or impossible for us to be able to go back and retrofit those materials into accessible materials. And that leads us to the notion that all content should be born accessible. It's a really important word for us to all think about. So you may have noticed when I told you what IDEA said, section 300-172, that you saw the term accessible instructional materials, and later on in 15 you saw the word accessible educational materials. And people sometimes get mixed up about, well, what does that mean? How are they the same? How are they different? Basically, AIM did refer, it is actually in IDEA, it does refer to print materials. However, AEM in 2015, changes that to educational materials and really subsumes that AIM. So whether you see it written or said AIM or AEM, we're really talking about the same materials, and all of them need to be accessible. And in general practice, AIM and AEM mean the same thing. If someone calls them one or calls them the other, it really doesn't matter, as long as their notion behind that is that all materials that are being used for learning are accessible. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Diana to talk a little bit more about this.
Right, and I just add an anecdote about what you were just talking about, the AIM and AEM. A lot of states had already passed laws that had the AIM in it, and they weren't going to go back and change it. So that's another reason why you'll see the AIM a lot, as well as the AEM. So when we're talking about accessibility, there are really two things that you have to keep in mind. There are two parts that have to be accessible. And one part is the information, that's the content that we're looking at. That content has to be made accessible. And the other part is that the technology, which is the delivery system, has to be accessible so that the students are able to use, to perceive, and to interact with the content. I'd like to also mention to you that many of these slides we do have links, and Leslie's been putting those links in the chat so that you can have them, as well as that you have links to the digital materials that are on the AIM website. There's a digital handout which you can go to and get later after the webinar, and it has all these links in it too for your use at a future time. So Joy, if you would click, we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit more now about what are accessible technologies. And we're talking about any device, hardware, software, or handheld equipment that provides access to life's activities. And this technology can be used by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities. And for it to be accessible, it either has to be directly usable without assistive technology or compatible and made usable with assistive technology. There are technologies that are still out there that lock out assistive technology. So you can't use the assistive technology with it. For example, you couldn't use a screen reader if you need it, or any other form of assistive technology. So for technology to be defined as being accessible, it has to be either directly usable or compatible and made usable with assistive technology. And that's a real key idea to keep in mind. So let's look again at the next slide, which has the definitions that we had from IDEA, section 300.5 and 300.6. And I'm sure many of you have already had all this drilled into your head many times, that an assistive technology device means any item, piece of equipment, or product system that's used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. And that word there, or the two words there, functional capabilities, is really important to keep in mind, because it's what the child is able to do functionally. That's what we have to consider as we're looking at these different technologies and seeing whether something would be assistive technology for them or not. An assistive technology service means any service that directly assists that child with a disability in the selection, acquisition, or use of an AT device. So these are also terms that are good to keep in mind. And it leads us to another slide, because this is a question we get an awful lot, as well as we hear people misunderstanding that the two definitions of digital text and digital technology-based materials are two different things. Digital text is that specialized format of print instructional materials that Joy was talking about. You take the content and change it to a different format. It's only the way it's presented. It's presented as digital text. But digital technology-based materials are different, and they include many different types of electronic learning materials, such as e-text, websites, learning management systems, software programs, apps. I'm sure you can think of and are thinking of many things as we talk about this. Be sure, if you have questions as we go along, and put those in the chat, and we appreciate the questions, and we would like to address those as they come up. So if you have questions along the way, be sure and put those in the chat. And Joy, would you take over and tell us about what we've learned from these things?
Well, as Diana said a little bit in the last slide, is that one of the lessons learned is that the need for accessible materials and technologies is related to function rather than to a specific disability category. And one of the challenges of this is that there are wonderful, wonderful libraries that are limited to people with certain disabilities. And I'll give you two examples. Bookshare and Learning Ally are two fabulous libraries, but you have to have a disability that is related to being able to read material in order to be eligible for those libraries. And historically this has been blindness, visual impairment, something called organic dysfunction, meaning something else is not working well, that keeps you from using this. And one of the things we know is that everybody who has a physical disability, which is one of the categories, doesn't necessarily have a physical disability that relates to their ability to read typical materials and use typical materials. So, but when we think about this, rather than saying, oh, if you are, well, I think it's fairly obvious that if you are blind, you are going to need some accessible materials. But if you have a physical disability, it does not necessarily mean that that physical disability has any functional impact on your ability to use materials as they're being used by everyone else. So the notion of thinking about what does someone who has a physical disability require accessible educational materials is sort of a useless question, because what you really need to be asking is, does his physical disability impact his ability to use the materials and technologies that are used by anyone else? If the answer is yes, it does, then absolutely, then that student needs accessible materials. So the key thing is to remember, we're talking about function. We're not just talking about disability category.
Joy, we have a question from the audience, from Sandra, and she says, so a textbook via Bookshare is digital text?
Sandra, I'm going to do the best I can with that. The best answer would come from Bookshare, but I would say yes, that if you get a textbook from Bookshare that began as a print material, then that print material is transformed into some sort of digital text for consuming. That's not the only format that they use, but digital text is a primary format, yes. So you are correct. That is a digital text format. It is not a born digital material. Otherwise, it would not need to be transformed in that particular way if it were born accessible. And that's sort of a whole different kind of thing. So if that helps, let me know. If you have a further follow-up question, please also let me know. That's a very good question. And thank you very much for maybe Sandra, you've started people feeling like, okay, now I can write one too. So don't hesitate to jump right in, because it feels really nice to know that you're all out there. So when we talk about functional categories, one of the things we need to really be aware of is that human function is huge. When we think about assistive technology, and Diana talked about that it's related to human function. And if you look on the left, you see things that are quite typically have to do with learning, like reading and written expression, math, problem solving, communication. Daily organization is what we used to call it, and now you'll hear it called executive function pretty much all the time, that planning that it takes to do whatever it is you do. And then there are, of course, specific task-related skills. But just as important to being a learner is the functional skill of how you behave. What about seeing and hearing and seating and positioning and self-care, mobility, recreation? You can think of more that I've not put there that are human functions. The sort of fun thing, having spent 30 years, more than 30 years in the assistive technology world as my great passion. At least I thought it was my great passion until I realized what really was my great passion was learning, and that assistive technology was important for a lot of people learning. But what was really fun when we started talking about accessible educational materials is we were really zeroing down to the notion, not totally, but to the notion of reading. You know, the notion of reading, and to be able to interact with materials that are actually interactable now that we have so many digital materials. So what do you have to do to read? And that's where the accessible educational materials part really is sort of exciting, because while everything else is a part of it, the purpose, the real function is being able to access, understand, interact with educational materials. So you may say, gee, we've spent a lot of time not talking about the IEP so far in this session on the IEP. So let's move to a brief overview of the IEP. So basically, when we talk about the IEP, there are two things, and most of us have been involved in both of these two things. One is the IEP is a document, and it's a document that describes the services that the student will receive as part of their free appropriate public education. So there's the IEP as a document, but there's also the IEP as a process. We get together as educators and families and as students to work together to develop and an individualized plan, which is then, of course, described in the IEP document. So we will be talking a lot about the document, but we certainly want to mention the notion of the process as well. And so what is an IEP supposed to do for anybody? Well, actually, what is learning supposed to be for everybody? But IDEA talks about this, particularly related to students with disabilities, the cycle of access and involvement and progress in the general curriculum. If you don't have access, meaning you cannot perceive information in the curriculum, it's terribly difficult to be involved and participate actively in that curriculum. So the access opens the door, the involvement takes place, and the result of having access and being able to participate is you make progress in the curriculum. And you can't see my hand, but I'm making an upward spiral, because we go around and around and around, and hopefully we're not having to go around that number 1 too many times, but we're looking at going around between 2 and 3 over and over and over. So when we think about connection of AIM and assistive technology, and by the way, you'll see us talk about both of these in this session, is when we talk about access. Then we're really talking about moving toward independence, being able to not just do something because someone else has done it for you or perhaps to you, but having some independence, which means some locus of control over what's happening to you. Involvement is deeply involved in participation. Involvement, sort of like inclusion, doesn't mean I'm involved because my body is in this place. It means I am an active participant in what's going on here. And progress leads to achievement. So those are the things that we'll be thinking about. And Diane, I'd like you to talk just a little bit about Endrew F and the Supreme Court decision, because I think it's something that's new to a lot of people, and it really ups the ante for us thinking about what we provide for students.
Yes, it is, and it's really important for everybody to understand what it is and also be connected to information about it. Joy, you just backtracked on the slides.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
What happens is every time I move my mouse, it goes somewhere else. I'm sorry.
That's something you don't want to.
My hand is off of it now.
I was recently presenting at the ATIA conference, and it came up in the session about people not knowing that this Endrew F decision had taken place because it previously we had a Rowley standard that everybody looked at as being the standard for judging what is FAPE, what a free appropriate public education standard is. But with the Endrew F decision, which is the Supreme Court unanimous decision, it changes that standard and it raises the ante. Previously, the courts had applied a merely more than de minimis standard when considering educational benefit, but that has changed now, and now based on the IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable the child to achieve educational benefits and to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. The goals may differ, but every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. That really changes the notion quite a bit that it was merely more than de minimis earlier, but that now you really have to look at what the child's situation is and also offer them the chance to meet challenging objectives. And on the AIM Center website, we have quite a few resources about Endrew F if you want to go in and read them. The Department of Ed has also put out a Q&A, which is what is listed on this slide and what Leslie's put up in the chat. But there are even more resources if you'd like to read the decision or other things that have been put up for people to understand this. But it really does change what the standard is for determining FAPE for a student. So it's very important for everybody to keep this in mind now and to move forward with being sure that the children have IEPs that are written to confer educational benefit.
And I'd like to add one little bit to that too. Some of you heard Diana mention the Rowley standard, and many of you probably know of the Rowley standard. And I will say to you that the ones who don't know of it, you do know of it. And I'll tell you why. Because it's when people talk about the Rowley standard, they often talk about, it seems to come up the most often when somebody wants to save money and they want to not spend something as expensive and say, well, we just need to do the minimum. The Rowley standard is the one that in sort of typical life, people tend to refer to as the one that said you don't have to have a Cadillac when a Chevrolet will do. Just remember, people, though, that a Cadillac and a Chevrolet are the same kind of vehicle, and they will both take you to the same place. You cannot be thinking that you can't say, well, we don't need to provide a Cadillac because a bicycle will do, if a bicycle won't take you to the same place in the same length of time. So fortunately, we can no longer really use that argument anymore. We really have to say a lot more about why we make the decisions we make. And I think what actually what in the Endrew F decision, like all decisions, it's going to become much clearer what it means to us as litigation occurs around the country. And of course, all of us want to learn, when it comes to litigation, all of us want to learn from the experiences of others. So if you're not sort of chuckling at that, you probably should be chuckling at that, and also saying, yes, indeed, that's how I want to learn, from the experiences of others. But it will be very good for all of us when we do have more about that. So Diana, where might those materials be in the IEP?
Well, some of the things we know is that IDEA tells us we have to do this, but it does not tell us how. So as we work through this, we're going to talk about places that it logically could be considered and included. And you might be thinking about, in your situation and your agency, if you have procedures that have already been developed, how you're handling it, how you might want to handle it in the future, and look at what, be questioning yourself as to what does this mean to you? So one of the things that we have said, and there is also a paper that's listed in your material handouts that Joy and I wrote along with Joanne Carter, who's an attorney and an EDD, about this topic. And you can get that. Leslie's put that in the chat too. You can also look at that document that we developed. In there we say, when AIM and technology are explicitly incorporated in the IEP, the likelihood is increased that the student's use of AIM will become an effective and integrated part of the learning process. So we all know about things that are written in the IEP that aren't really used, but the likelihood increases that everything will be more utilized if we are very explicit about how we put it in there. So let's look at the places where we might consider it. And these are the areas that we've pulled out: the evaluation results, the present levels of performance, special factors, annual goals, and this group of things: special ed and related services, supplementary aids and services, program modifications and supports, statewide assessment participation, and post-secondary goals and transition services. And we're going to be addressing each one of these separately as we move along.
So Diana, are you saying that it can be just almost anywhere?
These are the very logical places to consider the use of AIM, and a very appropriate place to put it.
Okay, thank you.
Did that answer your question?
It does indeed. And I guess you're going to tell us why it makes a difference in which place. So let's start with that.
Okay, let's look at the process that we're going to use as we look at each of these areas. We're going to look at what the requirements say legally, and then we're going to look at what the AIM and technology considerations might be at that point. So we know with evaluations that you're supposed to assess students in all areas of suspected disability. You use a variety of assessment tools and strategies, and you obtain information to assist in developing the content of the IEP. So some of the things you'd be considering and looking at and questioning would be, is printed text or is digital media a barrier for the student? Does the student need AIM? Does the student need assistive technology to access specialized formats or digital materials? So those are all things you'd be considering during the time of the assessment. You may not be answering all those questions at this point in time, but you need to know if there needs to be further evaluation and raise those questions and include them in the evaluation.
So Diana, can you tell us a little bit what that might look like?
Right. We're going to give you an example. And this is an example that you might put in a summary. We're going to work with Sean as we move through this process of the IEP development. and he's a 7th grade student who's previously been identified as having a learning disability. And with the most recent evaluation data, he's able to they find that he's able to understand grade level content, but is unable to independently derive meaning from print and technology-based materials. So what would you suspect from that? That suggests that Sean needs further evaluation to determine if specific formats and features might be needed to support his learning. So, Joy, if we move to the next slide, this is a summary of what we might have for the evaluation data after there's been further evaluation. So with further evaluation, it indicates that in order for Sean to participate and progress in the general ed curriculum, he requires a digital text format of printed materials. And not only does he remember the two sides of the AEM coin, the content and the technology which delivers that, he not only needs the digital text format of printed materials, but also the assistive technology that enables him to see and hear that content at the same time. That's what Joy referred to earlier. I think she mentioned audio supported reading. And so digital learning materials also will need to be accessible. They as we defined accessibility earlier, and allow the use of text-to-speech tools. So those are things that these are examples of what you might include in the evaluation data. All right, the next area that it might be appropriate to consider would be in present levels. And with present levels, it's really good to include a lot of information, as much as you can, that helps people understand what the student is able to do at the current time. So the requirements are that you describe the student's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, and describe how the disability affects his or her involvement and progress in the general ed curriculum. So when you're doing this, what are some of the things you might consider about do they need accessible AEM or accessible technology? So again, we ask the question, are they able to access and derive meaning from the print-based instructional materials? And if they're currently using, another question would be, is that if they're currently using accessible materials, do they need assistive technology to access that content? So these are some of the questions we'd be asking. Joy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. In this particular one, I have a strong prejudice about this, and I wish it were the law, but it's not. It's my prejudice. I think this is the place where it's really important to actually name the technology. We don't usually say name the technology, we say describe the technology. But the reason in the present levels that you want to actually name what the student is using, James reads on grade level when using his Chromebook with read and write software, something like that. Because it doesn't mean that we're not going to make a decision at some point to change what he's using, but we have to know what he's using now and how well he's doing with whatever he's using now to say, should we stay with this or does it need to be changed in some way? And to know that if it needs to be changed in some way, even something that has exactly the same features, but they just operate a little bit differently, we need to know that we're making that change. And if we don't put in the present levels of performance what those actual things are right now, then it's very hard to make a good decision, because we know that if we change the materials in some way or the technologies in some way, even for very good reasons, that there's going to be a dip in productivity while the student's learning to use the new materials. Easy for us to think about ourselves, because if you're a Mac user and somebody asks you to take notes in public with it projected on a Windows machine, your blood pressure goes up a little. Same way if you're a Windows user and somebody says, here, just do this on the Mac and we're going to project it so everybody can see it, no problem, right? Well, I've done it recently and boy, was it a problem. So just small changes can make huge differences. So here is the one place that and I think Diana agrees with me, that we would strongly recommend actually naming stuff. Not usually, but here. So thank you, Diana, for letting me say that.
Of course. Well, and this is a really important place to be very specific about things, because your goals and objectives are built from what they're doing at presently. So it's very important to have all that written in. So here's an example of what we might suggest for Sean. Again, that he's the 7th grade student with a learning ability, and we're more explicit here that he understands instructional content at grade level, but independently reads at the 4th grade level. So using a tablet computer with audio supported reading software, he successfully can perceive and interact with the digital text formats of the grade level textbooks and printed materials across the content areas. So by the use of the technology and the accessible materials, he's able to perform on grade level. So do we have a second? We have another slide, a B, don't we? Nope, sorry. Okay. We're moving. I was thinking that we had another example to talk about, so I apologize. So now we're going to move on to the special factors and look at those, what the requirements are and what the considerations are. In the requirements, you remember that there are 5 special factors that everyone has to consider in the development of every IEP. One has to do with behavior supports. Another was the language supports for limited English proficient students. Another has to do with Braille instruction. Another with communication. And then last, the 5th one is that we must consider whether or not the student needs assistive technology devices and or services. And one of the things I would like to bring out is on the communication factor, what many of us in the past read that one and thought it had to do only with students who had hearing impairments. But if you read it carefully, you'll see that it says you must consider communication factors for all students before it goes on to specifically mention what needs to be done for students who might have a hearing impairment. So we're going to make further points about that in just a minute. So we have to look carefully at what the legal law tells us about these special factors and what we need to look at. So we have to consider whether the student needs instruction in Braille or the use of Braille in relation to the accessible materials. Does the student need AIM, accessible materials or technologies, to perceive and interact with the written or orally presented information? Does the student need assistive technology to use those specialized contents to be able to access the content and be able to perceive and interact with that content? So these are the considerations we need to think about, and let's look at what some of the examples might be. With Sean, that he understands educational content at grade level, but's unable to read with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension at that level. He needs materials provided in a digital format to access the general curriculum. So that's an example of what we might state as a special factor for Sean. And we have a second example.
We do. I wanted to say one real quick thing here, and that is in this example, the special factors, and we definitely have said what he needs. keep in mind, though, that some people will look at this and say, oh, then, okay, they've said fluency and accuracy. So that's good. They've told you what are the issues that are causing problems. While you're providing him with specialized formats, which he needs in order to be successful right now, we're also going to continue to teach him to build his fluency and accuracy skills. So sometimes people say, well, if you give somebody specialized formats, then they'll never learn to read, when they think of reading as only a visual cognitive thing, which is obviously more than that. But that's the note. If they say, well, no, they'll never learn to read because you stopped teaching them to read in the typical way, well, you're right. They won't ever learn to read, but you're doing the two things at the same time. Thank you, Diana. Go on to B.
Okay. In B, we talk about that he needs the tablet or a computer with text-to-speech and word prediction to perceive and interact with a digital text format of grade level textbooks and other printed materials. So we're talking more about specifically what type of things he might need in order to access the content that of his grade level content.
And what's so good about that is it's very very specific about why he needs those things and then under what circumstances he needs those things. So that's another thing for us to think about as we're writing IEPs.
So we want to talk a little bit more about effective communication for the students with hearing, vision, or speech disabilities. There was a Dear Colleague letter written jointly by the Department of Ed and Department of Justice, and it talks about there being 3 legal mandates that are impact the effective communication for these students. IDEA, 504, and Title II of the ADA. Both FAPE, which is IDEA and 504 analysis apply, and then effective communication for ADA, that analysis applies. And with effective communication, that means that communication includes the visual, orally, and motorically presented communication. So the students have the right to be able to understand and have information presented to them in a way that they can perceive it and use it and act upon that information. So previously, this all applies to that special factor about communication. So you can take this to the point of that it includes written communication, and therefore this is a basis for saying that students with disabilities may need the accessible materials in order to be able to communicate with the written and orally presented materials. So sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. That particular one, I think, Diane, I always love what you say about that so many people look at that one and it says including students who are deaf and hard of hearing and think that it says only deaf and hard of hearing. And that this Dear Colleague letter that you just so well explained is actually saying, hey, people, this is not just about people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It certainly is about them, but it is not just about them. So thank you so much. Every time you talk about that, I learn more.
So, as I said earlier, you might be considering things that you might want to take as an action item after this webinar. And so this is one of the things you might consider. You might, if you have guidelines in your district or your agency, you might include in the development of the IEP that there might be a specific prompt, such as, does the student have a disability that prevents the effective use of standard educational materials? So, and if yes, does the student require specialized formats of printed materials or accessibility options in digital materials? It's just helpful many times to have that prompt there to urge people on to consider something that they might not be thinking about at that time. So this is something that districts and leadership might consider as something beneficial to add to be sure that students are getting the consideration that they need related to accessible materials.
Thank you. And now we're going to look at the annual goals and AIM and technology related to them. The requirements, the requirements with the annual goals are the measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals, and then also to describe how those goals will meet the student's disability-related needs so that the student can be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum. And so the AIM and the AT consideration would be, for which goals will AIM be needed to support this achievement of the goals and progress in the general curriculum? Because your student may have goals that don't have anything at all to do with AIM, but they may also have goals that are very directly involved with AIM. So you want to make sure that there's some correspondence there between them, either by including with accessible materials, et cetera, sort of like we'll do with our student that we're using. But then there's also the time where you may have a number of goals for which AIM is needed, and you might be able to somehow document in such a way that AIM is needed for these 5 goals or these 4 goals, rather than putting them in the IEP. Putting them directly into the goal, because you don't want to write 5 different times. James will need accessible educational materials with blah, 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 to do whatever it is. Anytime that he needs them, you want them to be available to him and working. So that's a key piece when you're thinking about the annual goals. It could be within, but it certainly has to be related to annual goals. And so here's an example of an annual goal. By May of 2015, when using the digital text format of the social studies materials and delivery technology, Sean will identify examples of sequential, comparative, and causal presentations of information in text with 80% accuracy. So in that particular one, they've actually included the digital text format and the delivery technology. Again, not by name, but by what those things do. You could even become a little more specific, but that's one goal. And think about how you might write multiple goals that involved things that he needed to do that you did not want to choose writing with the digital text format of materials and delivery technology every time. So there could be some ways to brainstorm that. So that's an example of the AT and the AIM in the IEP goal. So that brings us to that small little section, which seems to have virtually everything in it that so many of us on this call have spent our lives in this section. So the requirements of this special education and related services, supplementary agent services, program modifications and supports is huge. And we're going to go through it fairly quickly, but you'll be thinking about why would they go in one place or another, hopefully, as we go. So the requirements, of course, are to state what services, aids, modifications, supports will help the student advance toward their annual goals, be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum, and be educated with students with and without disabilities. So lots of least restrictive environment involved in this particular part too. So the AIM tech considerations that we might make is, how can accessible materials help this student be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum? Because again, spending 60% of your time or 80% of your time in a general education classroom, if you are not involved and making progress in the general curriculum, then one would have to wonder what was happening good for you there. The second one is AIM needed as a part of the student's special education and related services. If the student receives speech language services and oral motor conditions make it difficult or impossible for the student to speak clearly by mouth, then they perhaps need some assistive technology to do some of that speaking for them. We would say that so in that case, it would be part of the student's related service, or in some cases educational service, depending on how it is in your state, of speech language services. And then what supports will help the student use AIM. And I think that's one of the places where we can really hit hard in this section, is just having an accessible format or a format that is accessible to you, or having a piece of assistive technology that lets you do something, doesn't mean that you know how to use it to do what you're supposed to be doing with it. So what supports does the student need? What training and supports related to AIM and technology are needed by the student, but also by educators and by family, because all of us have to know something. It doesn't mean that we all have to know how to program something, or that we all have to know how to transcribe Braille on our own. But we do need to know some things about that use part. We all need to know some things about that use part. So some of the supports for use, what are we talking about here? Technology, of course, training, instructional strategies. What do I need to know as a teacher about how to ask questions correctly so that I can give this person an opportunity to say something much more than yes or no, but to not have them feel like the rest of the class is just hanging there waiting for 10 minutes while they get their act together, which usually doesn't make people feel very secure. What kinds of support services are available to the student and to others. And certainly the understanding of accommodations and modifications, and knowing that while we know there are times that we must make modifications, which are changes, that we always, always, always want to try to accommodate first, because an accommodation enables you to reach the same goal. The modification tends to change the goal. And if we change the goal without giving the student the greatest possible attempt to reach the goal, then what we are possibly doing, and I think a lot of this comes back to the Endrew stuff, is if we modify when we don't have to, we end up negatively impacting a student's opportunity to learn because of what we're not expecting of that student. So in action, putting this one into action, here's an example. Sean will use a tablet computer and/or other device that provides simultaneous visual and auditory output to support perception and interaction with digital text formats of grade level printed materials across the context areas. I mean, that is absolutely clear when he needs it, what he needs it for. And then the second piece, Sean will receive training in how to use the digital text format and technology for participation and achievement. And it's very likely that if that is a related service we're talking about there, that there are minutes and there's time related to this. And that can be an interesting challenge, because Sean may need a whole lot of support at the beginning, but he might need hardly any after a while. So something to think about there. And then the second part, again, examples, Sean's teachers and parents will receive training to support his use of the materials and technology. Doesn't say his father has to reinvent a new device. His father might, but that's not the purpose here. And Sean will require headphones and preferential seating in a quiet area of the classroom when he's reading with text-to-speech. So this gives you an opportunity to really show some of the hows and the whens, I think, in a very positive way. And that leads us to the one that everybody goes a little bit crazy over all the time. If you don't go crazy over statewide assessments and AT and AIM, you will at some point. So the requirement is to include a statement of appropriate assessment accommodations. This is one of those nice words, accommodations, that really comes from the testing. It's a gift from the testing community to the rest of us, and we are thankful for that gift. If the team determines that the student needs to take the alternative assessment, then they have to say why they can't take the regular assessment and why the particular alternative assessment is appropriate. So let's go over to the tech. What assessment accommodations are needed for a student who uses AIM? So that would be the question. And then how do these accommodations relate to the AIM and AT that the student receives in the classroom, receives and uses in the classroom, actually? So what we need to be really careful in this one about is it's not what's allowable on the test that drives what's usable in the classroom. Because in the classroom, you're learning, and you should be learning and learning and learning with the best possible tools. Sometimes that happens, so, well, it's not allowable on the test, so we can't use it. That's just not okay. And you can quote me on that. I put my name on that one, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. And then the other piece, of course, is What is the student going to be able to use? All right, let's make sure that while we're providing them with lots of opportunities to learn in the best possible way for them, let's also make sure that we provide them with opportunities to show what they know using what they can use on the statewide tests. So you're doing both things, and I don't think there's an educator out there that can't do both of those things in the course of a year. So I will challenge each and every one of you to that, and know that you will meet the challenge with no trouble at all. So an example of an assessment statement would be, consistent with the accommodations that Sean is using in the classroom, he will receive the following accommodations on the statewide assessment. Read aloud. And that's going to say something very specific about read aloud that's really important. Simultaneous visual and auditory access to text through the independent use of text-to-speech on all allowable parts of the assessment. Two important things. One of them is independent use, and the other one is all allowable parts. It is not making the assumption here that it's going to be allowable in all the places that you and I might think it should be allowable. But it is important to say, you can tell by looking at that he's not dictating to a scribe. He's using something that he can use to do this all by himself. And then the scribe for his writing, text input through independent use of word prediction software on all allowable parts of the assessment. Two, I think, pretty good examples. And then there's transition. And of course, transition is a big important thing, because we talk about the capital T transition, and a lot of that is this, but there's also the little t transition that we want to think about that doesn't exactly go to what we're talking about here, but we do have to think about it too, because there are lots of transition students go through in their life besides this one. So the requirements are to include post-secondary goals in the transition services in the IEP, and to develop that summary of performance of the student's academic achievement, functional performance, and on and on and on. So how do we help a student with their self-determination skills that they need? Or how do we help the student plan for his or her AIM and technology-related needs as he goes forward? And the example here is in Sean's home state. They start at the age of 14. However, in his school district, building self-determination skills begins earlier. So future transition planning might include goals such as Sean will advocate on his own behalf, determining when he needs to use what works best for him, and he will build skills needed to advocate for himself in post-secondary environments by leading discussions during IEP development. So that takes us to anytime you want to know more about any of this. The AIM Center is a lovely place, aem.cast.org. We invite you to come there as often as you can. We have one student, we have a lot of interesting student stories, but meeting Una is a lovely student story that you might want to see about how technology has not only leveled the field, but has sent Una, or has allowed Una to go to the mountaintop that she was intended for. And you'll read. I hope that's intriguing enough that you will want to go and read about Una right away. So we also have an updated resource that's again in that same statement that's so important. We now have an 2018 version. And remember that this is why it goes in the IEP, because it's not about selecting and acquiring AIM. It's not about selecting, acquiring accessible technologies. It's about using AIM, that the AIM becomes an effective, integrated part of the learning process for an individual student. I'm Joy Zabala. Thank you for joining us. Diana, you want to say farewell?
Farewell, I'm trying to type.
And we want to thank you all for joining us. And please take a moment to complete our webinar evaluation, which Leslie has put in the chat, and it's also in your PowerPoint if you have downloaded that. And there are many other ways to reach us at the AIM Center. You find any way, and we're there somewhere. So I'm going to leave this on the screen. I don't want to take any more of your time because I think we've already taken more than 2 minutes extra. So, however, we will remain here for a bit if anybody wants to remain with questions or comments in the chat box.